So the first thing, I'll take the first things first, and the first thing here is the first people. The people who were here on this land, in this hemisphere, on that day 500 and almost 10 years ago, on the 12th of October 1492, when a lost Italian seaman flying the flag of Spain washed up in a beach in the Caribbean, half a world away from where he thought he was, and got himself known as the Great Navigator. Yeah. The outcome of that process. The outcome of that process in the area of North America, referred to as the United States, is that the original people's holding, the first people's holdings, in terms of real property, that is to say land, been reduced by, on official estimate, 98.5%. Actually, it's closer to 97.5%. The population also, realistically speaking, was reduced during the same period of the geographical expropriation by 97.5% as well. The net holdings in aggregate of native North America within the 48 contiguous states portion of the continent comes to about 50 million acres. Now there's a certain irony or set of ironies that are embedded in this. First off, 50 million acres divided by the 2 million odd Indians that the federal government acknowledges as being such comes out to 25 acres per Indian, and 25 acres per Indian makes Indians, on a per capita basis, the largest landholding group in North America, despite the massive expropriation of property. Still, today, and within that 25 acres per Indian, in its aggregation to 50 million acres, you find 2/3 of what the United States of America today claims as its domestic uranium reserves. You find roughly 25% of the readily accessible low sulfur coal. You find 20% of the oil and the natural gas. You find such bauxite as is mineable in North America. You find copper, you find iron ore, you find industrial grade diamonds, you find a whole list of mineral resources. You find renewable resources like the last virgin timber stands, 50% of the salmon harvest in the Pacific Northwest, preeminent water rights throughout the arid West, where the entire population of Southern California at least seems to be moving all of a sudden. All of that in dominant society terms can be equated. Those estimates can be computed on the basis of dollars. The uranium's worth so much in its estimated quantity. The coal is worth so much in its estimated quantity. The gas, the oil. Keep on checking it off down the list. And when you're done, you have a column of figures. Add them up. And whatever the total is going to be, you've got to divide that total by those 2 million Indians again, and what you end up with, regardless of how you do the computation, is a population group that is the richest on a per capita basis in all of North America. That again is right here, right now, today. How many of you in the room know a rich Indian? Now, I'm not talking about Bill Gates rich or even Rockefeller rich. Nobody ought to be that rich. But as the dominant society, as the settler society computes wealth, this is a wealthy group on paper. That's the nominal situation. What's the practical reality? Well, I've been using government data to paint the profile thus far, so for consistency's sake, allow me to continue to use government's data. The American Indians, according to the government's data, right now, still, again, today, keep things in a current framework. It wouldn't have been different 25 years ago, and it wouldn't have been different 50 years ago. Okay, but right now, in the year 2001, American Indians are far and away the poorest population aggregate overall on the continent, experiencing the lowest lifetime and annual incomes, the highest rate of unemployment. I won't belabor you with the whole data set. The upshot of that is that you have a set of conditions. Okay, let me go to this impoverishment. Let me simply say this. We're not talking about being poor in the sense that you can't buy a new car when you decide to. We're not talking about not being able to change houses and upgrade. We're not talking about anything that relates to an advanced industrial state's sense of impoverishment. We're talking about people living on the Pine Ridge Reservation on a per capita income of $2,000 a year. You're talking third world level in poverty, right smack dab in the middle of the United States. You're talking unemployment rates that are not uncomfortable, but catastrophic. You're talking about 90th percentile unemployment on Pine Ridge every year for the last 50 years. You're talking about 60th percentile unemployment for Native America as a whole. That's the nature of it. And that computes into certain other factors as well. Sticking still with the federal data, you find that American Indians experience the highest rate of death from things like exposure and malnutrition. You find that American Indians experience the highest rate of death from things like infant mortality, 14 times the national average. You find that American Indians experience the highest rate of death by decisive margins with readily curable communicable diseases, and also rates of death that are unparalleled anywhere else in North American society from things like plague disease. Cut to the chase on that, you have reservation-based American Indian men experiencing a life expectancy of about 44.5 years at the turn of the millennium. You find American Indian women living on reservations have a life expectancy about 3 years longer. And that sounds like maybe American Indian women are doing better than the men. But then you peg the male longevity statistics of American Indians against that of the general population male, which is 71.8 years, okay? And you do the same with a female, and you find that the female in the general population outlives the male by approximately 8 years on average, and therefore proportionately American Indian women are actually doing worse than the men, although they're living 3 years longer on average. They have a 5-year greater deficit in terms of longevity as compared to their non-Indian sisters overall. These are longevity data that would be applicable to the overall American population in 1890. So we're a century behind the rest of the country in terms of quality of life, as they call it in San Francisco. And you might want to make the connection between the vaunted quality of life in San Francisco on the one hand and a degradation of living standards on American Indian reservations on the other, because there is a direct relationship between those two things. As Eduardo Galeano put it with respect to North America and the southern cone of South America, your wealth, he said, is our poverty, and that's exactly and equivalently applicable to the relationship between the dominant or the settler society on the one hand and native North America on the other. Now, how does that work? That works off the basis of something that was articulated most clearly in the Lone Wolf opinion of the Supreme Court in 1903, when the court announced unilaterally and rather arbitrarily, but drawing on some historical precedent, that the United States enjoyed a plenary authority over American Indians. That translated into normal people's talk means that they have an absolute and unchallengeable authority to make decisions in behalf of Indians. Okay? Concomitant to that, there's a reciprocal relation that was articulated in Lone Wolf, and that relation is that plenary power is attended by a trust or fiduciary responsibility to Indians, meaning that the federal government is obligated in its own law and in its own mind, self-appointed to fulfill a trustee status presiding over American Indian affairs and, most importantly, American Indian assets. One of the self-assigned prerogatives of this trustee relationship that it imposed upon the other nations within its claim boundaries is that it can change the form of indigenous assets. If your asset happens to be coal, it can mine it and change it into the form of money. Now, interesting thing about this particular trustee relationship that's set up is that the trustee is also the buyer of that asset which is being transformed, and it's being transformed into money at a price that trustee buyer is dictating, and Indians have no challengeable recourse under U.S. law to that. That's a colonial relation. Colonialism, being defined in international law, is the imposition of one nation upon another for purposes of its own profit, for purposes of its own dominance, its own sense of prestige, its own strategic interest, all of which will accrue at the direct expense of the colonized. I don't use the term nation in any rhetorical or figurative sense either. American Indians hold treaty relations with the federal government of the United States, 400 of them duly ratified by the Senate under the U.S. Constitution, Article 1, Section 10, as well as under international law, as is reflected in the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties. Treaty relations are compacts entered into only by co-equal sovereigns, that is, by fully sovereign nations. Every time the United States ratified a treaty with an American Indian people, it provided a formal recognition that the other party or parties to the treaty was a nation in its own right on an equal standing, entitled to the same rights as the federal government of the United States itself. So you have this recognition that there are nations other than the United States within the U.S. portion of the North American continent, all of which are subordinated directly to the presumed authority of the federal government of the United States for purposes of extracting their assets, their wealth, for the benefit of the dominant society to the detriment of the indigenous owners. And you have the catastrophic kinds of consequences to the people, to the population, that accrue from all such relationships. That's the health and demography data that I ran down a little bit before. That's the nature of the set of circumstances that was confronted by the American Indian movement in the early 1970s, and most forcefully on the Pine Ridge Reservation in the mid-1970s, that led to the counterinsurgency war, that led to the fatalities that I was talking about and a number of other things that we'll get to, and led to the specific circumstance of Leonard Peltier. Because what it was that was being done was the assertion of the rights to sovereign control over lands, lives, and destiny that is inherent to the treated status of American Indian people and is inherent to the fundamental human rights of any people under extant international law. It's the assertion of those rights which precipitated the counterinsurgency war, which brought the repression down.